Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the next steps in UFO research, and my guest is Colm Kelleher. Colm was the guest on a previous video, and I'm going to link to it right now. If you haven't seen the earlier video, I highly recommend it. It will really help you to get a better handle on what we'll be talking about today. Colm is a biochemist with an extensive background in cellular and molecular biology. He has served as Vice President and Chief Scientist for Environmental Control and Life Support Systems at Bigelow Aerospace. Additionally, he has managed the day-to-day operations of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program of the U.S. government through a contract given to the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies Organization, of which he was Deputy Administrator. He has served as Deputy Administrator for the National Institute for Discovery Science, and currently he plays a similar role at the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. He is co-author with George Knapp of Hunt for the Skinwalker, Science Confronts the Unexplained at a Remote Ranch in Utah. He is most recently co-author with George Knapp and James T. Lacatski of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider's account of the Secret Government UFO Program. Colm is based in the Las Vegas, Nevada area, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Colm. It's good to be with you once again.
Good to be here again, Jeff. Hopefully we can carry on the same conversation.
Well, we had a fascinating conversation earlier. I'm encouraging all of our viewers to watch our previous interview, so that'll give them a good footing to understand what we're going to do now, which is to go into much more detail about not only the next steps in UFO research, but what you've already learned, because there's so much we didn't cover. You had such an extensive project going on earlier. One of the most fascinating accounts in your book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, had to do with your own eyewitness observation of what I guess I'd have to describe as some creature like a dinosaur.
That was an interesting sequel to a very interesting dinner that occurred in Washington, D.C., early on in the program, and this is when we had essentially the best of the best from interagency groups of people at a dinner in Washington, D.C. Lacatski was there, Axelrod was there, Lou Elizondo, who at that time was not a UFO rock star. He was part of the group at the dinner. But one of the people at the dinner was a special agent called Juliet Witt, who had a lot of experience being out in the field, including some experience behind the lines in Russia. One of the things that came up on during the dinner was a discussion about the Skinwalker Ranch and what kind of approaches could be used in terms of sensor deployment, because Juliet Witt had a good background in sensors. So anyway, she arranged to hop on a plane, come out to Las Vegas, and the night before the deployment to the ranch, she met with myself and Robert Bigelow in the corporate headquarters in Las Vegas, and we gathered all of the equipment that we were going to bring with us, and that included just a few cameras and some night vision equipment. So we flew on Robert Bigelow's private plane up to the small airport in Vernal, Utah, which is about 30 miles from the ranch. And then we drove to the property. We got there sort of in the early afternoon. Myself and Juliet Witt walked the property, and she seemed really engaged and sort of, very interested in what all of the incidents that had happened on Skinwalker Ranch. So we walked the property. She took a lot of photographs. She went up on Skinwalker Ridge. She and I spent probably 2 hours going through the various parts of the property, and I was pointing out to her some landmarks where various incidents had occurred during the National Institute for Discovery Science part of the program, which had been a lot earlier. So night fell, and about 10 o'clock, myself and Robert Bigelow and Juliet headed down towards the west side of the property, and the western part of the Skinwalker Ranch has 2 abandoned homesteads, and we call them Homestead 2 and Homestead 3. We actually arrived at Homestead 2 because Homestead 2, from all of the previous experience on the property, had been kind of a grand central station of where a lot of different activities had occurred. So we brought these garden chairs with us. So here we were out in the middle of nowhere on a small pasture about 30 yards away from Homestead 2, and we were facing in opposite directions. So my chair was facing outwards, Robert's chair was facing outwards, Juliet Witt's chair was facing outwards. So we were actually covering about 360 degrees around the property. And at that stage, Juliet started getting fairly nervous because, maybe it was the fact that it was absolute pitch darkness. It was obvious there was nothing in the environment except darkness. And you could see in the distance a couple of faint lights of homesteads. But Robert Bigelow got up from the chair and walked south from where we were. I got up from my chair and walked essentially west towards, there was a tree line close by. And Juliet Witt sort of said, okay, I'm on my own out here. So she basically came in my direction. And it was around that time when she was about 10, 15 yards away from me. I saw this creature that was coming from the south heading north. But the really strange thing about it was that it was not making any noise. And, there were quite a few leaves on the ground. There should have been rustling. I noticed that there was a silence also. There was no evidence of any sort of crickets or any nighttime noises. It was almost like a cone of silence had descended on the property. And so this creature was coming towards us, and it passed us by about 30 feet away. It looked to me like it was a really unusual looking creature. It had what looked like spines, or not spines, but kind of curves on its back, almost like a mini dinosaur. And it also had a very flat, large tail that looked, the nearest equivalent I could think of was a beaver. But this thing passed us about 30 feet away, heading north, completely ignored us as if we were not there. Both Juliet and I saw it from different vantage points. And I think it was about maybe in the region of maybe 100 pounds or so. It was not a huge animal, but it was motoring sort of silently. It went beyond the wall of the old homestead, still motoring, and myself and Juliet followed it to see where it was going. By the time we got to the edge of the homestead, it was gone. So this creature then sort of must have gone around the wall of the homestead and turned right, which would have put it out of our view. So we ran up to that area, and there was absolutely nothing available. We couldn't see anything. At that stage, we were making a reasonable amount of noise. So Robert Bigelow came from the south and joined us, and the three of us looked around the property in the area just north of that old homestead. We could not find any trace of this creature. The creature itself, to me, looked, as I said, like a mini mini version of a dinosaur with these ridges on its back, and a sort of a flattened tail. It was pretty dark, but it was light enough to see that this thing was very unusual looking, and the absolute silence, I guess, was what really confounded me.
Now, earlier you described the evening as being pitch black, but you had night vision equipment with you. Were you using it?
No, we basically were transfixed by this, this, I guess it was the combination of the Oz effect, or this cone of silence that descended on us, and the fact that this was a very unusual creature. It also happened very, very quickly, relatively. So we did engage our night vision binoculars when we were searching for the creature, but we did not switch them on in the heat of the moment. And I can tell you from personal experience on that property, the lightning speed with which these events happen usually precludes engaging, unless you've got a sensor, a fixed sensor that's running all the time. It tends to be very, very difficult to engage something that happens extremely quickly, unexpectedly. And, by the time you engage the equipment, this creature was gone by the time, I started looking with night vision binoculars.
Now, in our very earlier interview, our first interview, your first sighting that you described was what one would have to call a UFO. It was an object in the sky that made a hairpin turn practically right above you. Do you think that the creature that you and Juliet both saw that evening is in some sense related to UFO appearances?
That's a really good question, because Skinwalker Ranch, as you know, is sort of the center point for a lot of anomalies, but primarily it is also the center for a lot of sightings of UFO objects. That UFO that I personally sighted was one of many quote unquote nuts and bolts objects that were sighted by various people over a 25-year period. So, the original Sherman family, for example, were absolutely deluged by a combination of nuts and bolts type metallic looking craft. At the same time, they had cattle mutilations. At the same time, they had a lot of poltergeist activity, objects appearing, disappearing, discarnate voices, and all of that. So, but they also had these nuts and bolts UFOs. When we took over the property, I had that sighting of a nuts and bolts object. Axelrod, when he was on the property in 2009, also saw and actually photographed what looked like a nuts and bolts metallic looking craft in the daylight. And then after 2016, when Brandon Fugel purchased the property, he is on the record as sighting nuts and bolts craft. So you've got this sort of 25-year history of what looked like metallic objects appearing and disappearing on this property, and overlaid at the same time in the same place, you've got a long history of unusual looking creatures, cattle mutilations, poltergeist activity, a whole smorgasbord of unusual anomalies. So are they related is the question. They're happening at the same time. They're happening at the same location. I would, from a hypothesis point of view, suggest that they're probably related.
Now, I'm going to digress a little bit, but I think it's important because many of the commenters on our previous video noticed that you refer to Axelrod, and as I recall, it's a pseudonym to hide the identity of the actual person. But many people have pointed out that in his book, Penetration, Ingo Swann uses the same name for a mysterious individual who accompanied him on what appears to be a remarkable UFO sighting somewhere up north, maybe Alaska. And people are saying, could this be the same Axelrod? And so I wonder if you could clear that up.
The answer to the question, is it the same Axelrod, is no, it is not the same Axelrod. But when we were casting around for a pseudonym for this high-level individual from the Navy who had top secret SCI clearances, we did come up with the name Axelrod as a homage to to Ingo Swann's book Penetration. So the name Axelrod is no accident. We were basically tipping our hat to what was a very fundamental book about the ET UFO topic that Ingo Swann penned. But after that, there's really no correspondence. The individuals are completely different.
It would seem to me, given that it wasn't just the Skinwalker Ranch, but it was neighboring ranches as well in that particular area of northern Utah where these things occurred, that people have often used the word a portal, like a doorway between dimensions. And if such a thing existed, that might account for a wide range of manifestations that seem to appear and disappear quickly, as if they're coming in and out of a portal that has some sort of geographic specificity.
In the Hunt for the Skinwalker book, we described a series of events that happened in August of 2007 where there were two investigators on the Skinwalker Ridge overseeing the Homestead 2, which is the location that I just talked about, this unusual creature that we had, that myself and Juliet Witt had seen. So these two people were just packing up at the end of a very long night of watching. It was in the sort of 2 a.m. area. And they had just sort of packed all their equipment up when one of the individuals noticed down on the track near Homestead 2, there was this sort of faint, dull, yellowish light that had appeared on the track. And they couldn't figure out if it was light reflecting off a piece of glass or it didn't look particularly interesting. But as they watched it, it seemed to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So at that stage, they decided time to unpack the gear. So one of them unpacked the night vision binoculars, Generation 3 night vision binoculars, and the other guy unpacked a camera with, at that time in the late 1990s, they were still using infrared film in cameras. So they started looking at at this light as it got bigger and bigger on this track. The guy looking, using the infrared film, was taking long exposure shots, but could see nothing except this 3-foot diameter now at this stage, yellowish light that was appearing on the track. The other guy through night vision binoculars saw something completely different, and that was a 3-dimensional, what looked like some sort of a tunnel, and through this tunnel there was he described it later when we debriefed him as a sort of a completely black humanoid-looking creature that was physically crawling through a tunnel of light. And this tunnel was about 3 or 4 feet located off the ground. And so this creature sort of elbowed its way through the tunnel, stood up on the ground and disappeared into the night. And these two guys, the other guy with the camera had not seen anything, but through the night vision binoculars, this guy had seen this panoramic view of what looked like a tunnel and something crawling through the tunnel. So, when you mention portal, that incident immediately came to mind. But, in terms of the the different types of creatures that were seen. I referred in our last conversation to the fact that the AAWSAP program had sort of meticulously started interviewing people in a 3 to 5 mile radius around the property to see if Skinwalker Ranch was sort of unique. We already had data from the NIDS era that it probably wasn't unique, but we compiled over a 2-year period literally dozens of different testimonies from different people in the 3 to 5 mile radius around the ranch. And many of them described strange creatures, particularly creatures that looked like four-legged creatures that were standing on 2 legs and able to move on 2 legs. So in the last conversation we had, I described this creature that Axelrod and his family had encountered all the way out on the East Coast. Well, a lot of the interviews that we conducted around Skinwalker Ranch actually documented a plethora of sightings, and these were not particularly necessarily recent sightings, but they were sightings of these 2-legged creatures or 4-legged creatures that were standing on 2 legs and could walk. So we interviewed a lot of these people, and we actually got a map of the location, that a Google map of Skinwalker Ranch and the area surrounding Skinwalker Ranch. And on that map, we located all of the witness sightings, and we asked the witnesses what direction were these creatures moving in general. And once we plotted them on a Google map, we could see this series of lines that seemed to be going from southeast to northwest. And these plots on the Google map, they almost looked like a series of straight lines that were running from southeast to northwest. Some of them crossed the Skinwalker Ranch and some of them didn't. And so the next step that we did as part of the AAWSAP investigation was that we located a series of game cameras along these. We hypothesized that these lines represented some sort of travel routes or migration routes for these creatures. So just towards the end of the AAWSAP program, we had located multiple different game cameras on these routes to see if we could detect anything on the game cameras. And the program ended at exactly the wrong time, because we had the capacity, we think, to record and obtain evidence apart from eyewitness evidence of these creatures.
So when the government discontinued their funding, everything shut down at that point?
Yes, everything was shut down. There was a 3-month no-cost extension from September to December for AAWSAP to wrap up all of the different projects. So by the time December 2009 came around, everything was shut down. The 50 people who had been employed full-time during AAWSAP were essentially let go. Standard government contractor rule of thumb is when a project is terminated, contract is terminated, the team is usually either reallocated or disbanded. And in our case, there was really no other way except to disband the teams, which I felt was a great pity. I mean, if I had my choice in the future for a future UFO program, I would recapitulate AAWSAP and carry it on for 5 years, not 2 years, because we had a well-oiled machine that was beginning to rock and roll. And at the end of the AAWSAP program, it came very abruptly due to a whole bunch of different political intersections and interagency unease. So if I had a choice, I would recapitulate that program for 5 years.
Now, a lot of people would say that the government isn't really capable of managing a program dealing with phenomenon of such high strangeness. You've had experience both with the government and with the private UFO groups. Do you think private funding and private UFO groups have greater capability in this area than the government would?
I think there's a case to be made for a public-private partnership, so to speak. So and the Defense Intelligence Agency that contracted Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies did have this public-private partnership, and we were very, very lucky that we were able to interact so easily and so closely with James Lacatski and his team out in Washington, D.C. And I would guess a lot of programs might not have been so seamless and well executed, but we were very, very lucky. So if I had a choice, it would be to combine a public-private partnership. We see in the aerospace industry, for example, NASA and SpaceX have got public-private partnerships down to a T, where NASA is not overtly intrusive into the way SpaceX operates, and at the same time, it allows the resources of the United States government to work in concert with a private enterprise corporation. That would be my idea. But a government-only UFO program is, in my opinion, is not going to be very effective.
Well, going back to the notion of a portal or of some sort of geographic specificity, I understand that you looked around the world to see if there were other areas that seemed to be hotspots for paranormal activity. And it does seem as if phenomena of this sort are not evenly distributed. They seem to center around particular locations.
Yes, that's correct. And we did, during the National Institute for Discovery Science days, we did spend a lot of time in some alternative locations like Dulce, New Mexico, which is this located on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation in Dulce, New Mexico. It too has a very strange history of a combined activity of UFO sightings by multiple members of the Apache tribe. And at the same time, lots of Bigfoot sightings, lots of unusual creature sightings, a lot of poltergeist activity, a lot of orbs are seen in that vicinity. So we spent a lot of time in Dulce, New Mexico. We also paid close attention to the Crestone, Colorado area, the San Luis Valley, which Christopher O'Brien has mapped out over the years in terms of unusual activity. And we got a lot of reports of the same thing overlaid upon UFO activity. There was a lot of reports of unusual creatures and a lot of spooky poltergeist type of activity there. But we also know Yakima Reservation up in Washington. And on the East Coast, there are several hotspots in New York State. Perm, Russia is another place that we've heard of, and even Hestelen, the Hestelen Valley in Norway, even though it's been primarily a large focus of an autonomous UAP surveillance network that takes autonomous sensor recordings. There has been quite a lot of stories coming out of the Hestelen Valley of other more paranormal type activity, which the engineers have not spent a lot of time working on. But there is a suggestion, at least, of paranormal activity. I attended a conference recently at Esalen, and I had some really interesting interactions with a guy from Colombia who had actually described a location in Colombia that had, or I think it was Argentina actually, that had a lot of activity that very closely paralleled the activity on Skinwalker Ranch. So I think Skinwalker Ranch just happens to be very well studied over the last 25 years, but I don't think it's a particularly unusual location for these so-called hotspots. And, we really have no idea why these hotspots occur in these particular locations on the planet.
Were you able to identify, for purposes of a scientific control, areas where paranormal phenomenon just don't seem to occur at all?
We did not spend a lot of time investigating areas where there were no phenomena. That is a really important part of a longer study. We were in the sort of initial data gathering parts of these studies, both during the National Institute for Discovery Science and also during the AAWSAP program. So I think your suggestion has to be included as a part of future investigations, but we did not spend a lot of time investigating areas where there was no activity.
I'm under the impression that researchers have looked into the question of, could this just be some psychological phenomena? And if that were the case, one would expect to find more of it in areas of dense population, whereas it seems as if these things occur in areas where there's less density of population.
That is true, but also another point associated with this is that there is anecdotal evidence of these creatures, quote unquote, tend to leave physical impressions. During our last conversation, I mentioned the upright wolf-like creature that seemed to be associated with some deep claw marks on the tree where the wife had seen this creature on their property. Another example of that is that we interviewed some people about a mile. It was southwest of the Skinwalker Ranch, who had interacted with one of these two-legged or four-legged creatures on their property, who was running away from them. The guy had a rifle with him and shot at this creature, and he was absolutely certain he had hit the creature as it was running away, did not stop the creature, but they found blood in the area. This was about a year prior to the AAWSAP program interviewing this individual, but he was adamant that this creature had bled after being shot. So I think that it's more than psychological happenings. I think these what are seen or perceived also interact with the environment and leave physical traces. I'm not saying that they're not psychological happenings. I'm just saying that they also leave physical traces.
Back to the portal hypothesis, there's a lot of speculation, not only in science fiction, but among serious scientists, having to do with the multiverse, with parallel universes. There's a lot of mathematical work going on and theoretical physical work going on in that realm. Have you interacted with any of the theorists who are looking into these things?
One of the NIDS scientists, Eric Davis, has done a lot of work on wormhole physics, and he worked a lot with Hal Puthoff, and to the extent that Hal Puthoff has also done a lot of theoretical physics analysis on the so-called zero-point field, and also metric engineering. We have interacted with those people. But I guess from my perspective, the UFO future of UFO discourse does, in my opinion, have a future with the sort of the burgeoning increase in activity regarding human consciousness, and I think that my background is biological, so I guess I tend to more gravitate towards people like Bernardo Kastrup, who has done a lot of work. I noticed you had him on your program recently. I came across his work a couple of years ago. I've seen some of his blogs on Scientific America. I've read most of his book, The Idea of the World. I also, I have looked at Donald Hoffman, who is from UC Irvine, and again, he has some very unusual, viewpoints on the role of consciousness. Jeffrey Kripal, who I've worked with quite a lot. I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Kripal because of the work that he was doing with the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies as a part of the essay competition. I'm aware of Federico Fahin, who has done a lot of work on consciousness, and Edward Kelly from the University of Virginia. So I would say in the last 10 years, there's been a revolution in the focus on consciousness as being primary. So if I had to look for low-hanging fruit, somewhat low-hanging fruit for the future of UFO study, I would probably focus on the impact of these new visions of consciousness and what happens. Is the UFO phenomenon in any way relevant to these new visions of consciousness? I am aware of the theoretical physics behind some of these portal theories, but I'm not a physicist, so I don't tend to gravitate in that direction. But I would see, there's plenty of ripe low-hanging fruit there also.
Well, given that your background is in biology, let's focus on that for a bit. One of the issues that we discussed last time was the hitchhiker effect, that once people are exposed to the phenomena in one location and they travel back to their home thousands of miles away, the phenomena, whatever it might be, seems to follow them. And as I recall, the individual who witnessed this small dinosaur-like creature with you, Juliet Witt, if that's her real name, I think it is, also experienced the hitchhiker effect.
Yes, she absolutely did. It is not her real name because we were told by the Pentagon that any people who are active duty military or currently working within the United States government and the Pentagon, and she is, we were obliged to change their names as a condition of publishing the book. So that is not her real name, but Juliet Witt did confront a lot of unusual activity when she got back. Some of that unusual activity, it sort of really seemed to focus on her roommate, who eventually, because there were so many very strange poltergeist activity, he woke up several times with black humanoid shadows literally over his bed. He was absolutely terrified, so he left. And but Juliet Witt was told me, about one incident where she and a friend were downstairs in they had a small rack with wine bottles on it, and two of those wine bottles literally flew across the room right in front of them and smashed against the wall. It was a very sort of graphic and somewhat violent demonstration. On another occasion, she was just driving out of her home when this very large, she described it as a very large owl, literally attacked her car. I mean, it came down and banged against the front of her car and left claw marks on the paint of her car. So she was pretty terrified. She has a young daughter who has also seen a lot of activity, including, and this is an aspect that I find quite interesting. She has seen people who are obviously deceased. So I've also interviewed other people who have had the hitchhiker effect, and they have reported also seeing people who are deceased. So there's this weird overlap between quote unquote the afterlife and some of these hitchhiker effects that have emanated from Skinwalker Ranch. I should also point out that Skinwalker Ranch is not the only location that give rise to these so-called hitchhiker effects. We had some one particular medical injury case that we investigated that ended up having a hitchhiker effect, and both of the individuals involved in that case had nothing whatever to do with Skinwalker Ranch. This occasion I'm thinking of, there was a biotechnologist who was driving on his way home to Bend, Oregon. He had his teenage daughter in the car, just back from college, and she noticed out beside the road where they were traveling, they were doing maybe 75, 80 miles an hour, three bright blue objects that seemed to be floating erratically and moving very erratically, quickly and stopping and starting again as they were driving past. Immediately upon seeing these objects, it seemed like all three objects came right towards the car. It was almost like it was a signal. One object went straight across their windshield, and they saw it moving right across their windshield. The other two actually came into the car. One of them went right across the dashboard in front of the two people, and the other entered the driver, the biotechnologist guy, in his left shoulder, went right through his body at the upper chest area and exited his right shoulder. His daughter watched this, flying out in front of her, and it exited the car. This guy started having health effects within a very short period of time after that incident. Began to get headaches the next morning. Woke up with sunburn on the left-hand side of his face. Also, his left eye and left ear were starting to swell up. A lot of fluid started accumulating. Began to lose hair within probably 3 or 4 days after this incident. And, long story short is that there was an MD, PhD, one of our investigators spent a lot of time with this guy over many, many months, and actually it went into years. We had serial blood samples. We had many other measurements from the health status of this guy. So we actually were fortunate to have blood samples from before the incident, and also many blood samples after the incident. So we were able to actually track changes in his immune system over time, both before and after this incident. And so we could see multiple changes in the neutrophil lymphocyte ratios. We could see as this guy eventually came down with a very rare form of ductal carcinoma. Luckily, it was in situ, so it was not metastatic. And so within 2 or 3 years, this guy was okay health-wise. But for that couple of years after the incident that had happened with this blue object that went right through his body, he had a plethora of health effects, which were actually extremely well documented. But the daughter, his daughter, who was beside him in the car as a passenger, did not have any adverse health effects. But when she went back to her college in Connecticut, her roommates started reporting there was an explosion of strange activity in their household in Connecticut. There was 4 people who shared this house, and all of them reported these strange noises in their homes. Orbs would fly through their rooms. Unusual creatures were seen in the vicinity. So again, this hitchhiker effect that had absolutely nothing with Skinwalker Ranch seemed to be associated with this very dramatic medical injury case that involved the interactions with these small UFOs.
The small UFO was like an orb. Some people, I think, associate them with another poorly understood phenomenon, probably little more than a label called ball lightning.
Yes, and we have actually looked at that in terms of the correlations between ball lightning and these orbs. And Eric Davis, who used to work for National Institute for Discovery Science, did a lot of close examination in terms of energy production, also the way these orbs in many cases seem to move. They seem to be reactive. They seem to move, quote unquote, intelligently. They seem to be able to dodge out of the way. When you put a flashlight on, they can move around away from flashlights. So there was a number of different discrepancies between ball lightning in terms of piezoelectric generation of ball lightning and associated with ball lightning that did not seem to be the case with respect to these orbs that had been documented both on this Skinwalker Ranch and in various locations like this place in Oregon.
I might be incorrect about this, but I seem to recall in your book that this particular scientist in Oregon also had a dream shortly after he was invaded by this orb. And in the dream, it was as if there were some sort of entities or figures who were endeavoring to heal him.
That's correct. He had a very, very vivid dream within hours of this object that traveled through him. And in the dream, as you mentioned, this creature could only see it out of his peripheral vision, so he did not have a good description of the creature. Sort of went into his left shoulder with either his finger or some instrument, and basically it seemed to the biotechnologist that this entity was trying to heal him, and there was words to the effect like this should improve over time, or there was some positive affirmations from the entity to the effect that this should not cause you any trouble.
And as I recall in the book, the conclusion was that whatever harmful effect occurred to this individual was not deliberate. Like these UFO phenomena may end up harming people, but it's sort of in passing, accidental, that they don't seem to have harmful intentions.
Yes, that is correct. We were never able to document any cases that we looked at that seemed to be in that category of a deliberate intent to harm humans. There was one exception that we came across, and that was another medical injury case that we investigated closely in Georgia. And that was when this guy, he had his son and some friends in a tent outside the backyard, went outside to check on them, but his dog was really barking vociferously outside. So he was also investigating the dog barking. He looked up, and right above his property was this very, very large, silent black triangle that was floating above his property. I mean, making no noise whatsoever. It's very difficult to estimate altitude at night, but he estimated it was very low, less than 1,000 feet away from him. And so he tried to take cell phone pictures. His cell phone would not work. So we went back into his house and took a large, very powerful flashlight that he had, went back out and shone the flashlight at this object to see if he could see it, more clearly. Within a second of him flashing the flashlight at it, a blue beam from this triangular object hit him squarely. It was like a fairly intense beam that he could feel the heat. So he turned around to protect himself and sort of crouched away from the beam. But this beam actually started burning him. So he went inside to get away from it. And he looked at this object outside the window for the next or from his vantage point inside the house through the window. And this object took off at a very, very high rate of speed within a few minutes. But again, it was the same kind of medical injury. He woke up with a lot of sunburn. He had a strong metallic taste in his mouth. He started losing his hair. Again, we had the physician scientists interact with him, taking blood samples, went to the emergency room, went to hospitals, and he had a long term health effects that he eventually, after a couple of years, began to get better. But he had a lot of different negative health effects. So you could ask the question, that blue beam that came from the triangular shaped object, was that some sort of a instantaneous reaction that had no sort of aggressive intent, or what was it aggressive intent? We could not, discriminate between something where he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the biotechnologist in Oregon happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We could never definitively nail down that there was hostile intent in terms of any of these activities. We did document, for the purposes of the AAWSAP deliverables, that, being in the vicinity of these UFOs sometimes is bad for your health. But that's a very different thing from saying that these are actually a threat, because a threat implies intent. And we really literally have no idea in terms of what the quote unquote intent of these objects are. So we were not able to deliver a report to the Defense Intelligence Agency saying that these UFOs were a threat. We did not have the data to back that up.
There's so many diverse phenomena that we're talking about here: orbs and triangle UFOs and dinosaur-like creatures and wolf-like creatures that walk on two legs and portals and tunnels. There is a possibility that these are all distinct, unrelated phenomena that are just more common than people appreciate because they're so bizarre they don't get reported in the mainstream media, or they might be all related. They might be a single phenomenon that manifests in many different ways. I have to assume we really aren't ready to answer that question yet.
I would agree with you there. I don't think we are ready to answer that question. I mean, when you say this sort of co-location phenomenon, I was just thinking of another location up near Malmstrom Air Force Base. We interacted a lot during National Institute for Discovery Science with Captain Keith Wolverton, who wrote a very interesting book on the cattle mutilation phenomenon called Mystery Stalks the Prairie. And he was a captain in the police force adjacent to Malmstrom Air Force Base up in Great Falls, Montana, during the late 1970s, when literally all hell broke loose, when the Air Force Base started reporting a whole bunch of UFOs that were interacting with the Air Force Base, and they would launch aircraft to try to intercept these UFOs and have absolutely no success regarding the interactions. But simultaneously with the UFO activity, Wolverton and his group of police officers, and they had a veterinarian on staff, documented an enormous number of cattle mutilations ringing around Malmstrom Air Force Base. They also interviewed a lot of these ranchers who were having these effects, and the ranchers told them about a lot of unusual creatures. They were reporting Bigfoot type creatures, unusual creatures that were coming out of the night, orbs in their homes, poltergeist activity. So, Captain Wolverton would get a call from the base commander asking him for help in terms of tracking UFOs. And at the same time, Wolverton would cooperate with the people on Malmstrom Air Force Base. But here we had, missile bases that were getting interfered with by UFOs. And at the same time, this underbelly of extremely anomalous phenomena that were occurring. So the co-location and the temporal sort of coincidence of these phenomena with UFOs that were actually causing national security concerns at Malmstrom Air Force Base was really no different from what was occurring on Skinwalker Ranch or Dulce, New Mexico, or, the Hessdalen Valley, or any of these locations. But I would hesitate to say that they are cause and effect. I've heard theories that, quote unquote, portals open and a lot of this stuff gets dragged through when UFOs come through portals. They automatically drag through a lot of these phenomena, but that's absolute speculation. And I much prefer the whole focus being on field research, because I don't think we have anything like enough data to start speculating on what these cause and effect relationships might be. I think, the future of the UFO phenomenon lies in additional research. And I would be very hopeful that maybe something might transpire out of the recent passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, which does include this very provocative amendment in the NDAA that seems to indicate that they might take UFOs seriously. But there's really no telling in terms of how easy it is for the United States government to downplay UFO activity and UFO investigations.
On the other hand, it does seem as if other governments have their own research programs going on.
Yes, Senator Reid recently passed away, and he was instrumental in the generation of the AAWSAP program, because one of his primary concerns is exactly what you have just alluded to, that other countries probably have a less restrictive view in terms of UFO research. And one of the projects that the AAWSAP program undertook was the full translation of a set of documents that came out of then Soviet Union, that were carried out of the Soviet Union by investigative journalist George Knapp in the early 90s, just during the period of perestroika. And there was a lot of documentation that he was given by people literally in back alleys in the what used to be the Soviet Union. But AAWSAP program went through a process of translating these documents. We had analysts looking at these documents, and we assembled an organizational chart for the Soviet Union focus on the UFO topic back in early 1991. And we were astonished at the level of sophistication of what we saw in terms of this organizational chart. There were literally dozens of government departments, top universities were part of this. There was a shadowy unit called Unit 73790 that seemed to be very much involved with the orchestration of the Soviet Union's UFO program. But that program is 30 years old. It was we documented it being full up and running in either 1990 or 1991, and compare that to the Johnny-come-lately focus on the sort of bare acknowledgement of interactions between UFOs and F-18 pilots, aircraft carrier incidents that happened off the east and west coast. The United States And Senator Reid was very concerned about this, that the United States was definitely behind the curve in terms of the level of sophistication of these programs. And we don't know what China's doing either. I suspect that the level of focus on these kinds of activities is the same in China as it is in Russia. But I have no way of validating that.
And there's also countries like Brazil and France to consider.
The Brazilian government especially has had a long-standing high level of interest in the UFO topic. One of the AAWSAP programs that we conducted was also focused on the so-called Colares incidents that happened on the northeast coast of Brazil in the late 1970s, in which the Brazilian Air Force intelligence set up camp on Colares Island because the UFO intrusions were so frequent and so intensive over a 3 to 4 month period in the late 1970s. They documented, they filmed, they interviewed eyewitnesses. Many people were injured and a couple of people were allegedly even killed as a result of these UFOs. If ever I was to suggest that there was an exception to this idea that UFOs have never harmed humans, I would say that the Colares Island incidents might be an exception to this. But again, we have no way of documenting beyond historical documentation. And the AAWSAP program did generate a very large document that summarized all of the activities in Brazil. But we were also very fortunate that one of the leaders in the Brazilian government, a guy called General Uchoa, was very amenable to Brazilian government cooperating with release of documents pertaining to various aspects of the UFO phenomenon. So the Brazilian government has been, by and large, very, very open in terms of release of large volumes of documents. And many of those documents do pertain to the so-called Operation Prato or the Colares incidents.
Well, there's MUFON. I know you've had extensive interactions with MUFON. There have been other civilian organizations involved in gathering data related to UFOs, probably more than a dozen just in the United States. What's your evaluation of their capability?
I believe, and we're talking from personal experience with the AAWSAP program, because we had a contract with MUFON that ran during 2009. MUFON has the great fortune to cover all 50 states in the United States. They have a web of investigators and state directors that is quite efficient in terms of gathering information on the UFO phenomenon. So back in 2009, we contracted with the MUFON organization, and the idea was that we paid MUFON in order to receive information on UFO activity that was happening anywhere in the United States. And we had a weekly and sometimes more frequent teleconference call with the MUFON program manager of this project. His name was Richard Lang. We had program managers that were in weekly communication with MUFON. The end result was a very, very efficient collaboration where dozens and dozens of cases were funneled through the pipeline, and either BAS AAWSAP investigators were deployed to investigate some of these cases, or MUFON investigators were deployed to investigate these cases. And AAWSAP BAS paid for expenses like hotels and flights and per diems in order for MUFON investigators to investigate. So over that period of time during 2009, we had a very, very collaborative working relationship with Richard Lang and his team, in which We felt it was an extremely productive relationship. And I know Richard Lang has gone on the record saying that the relationship between AAWSAP, BAS, and MUFON was also very productive. I'm not familiar with other organizations in the United States, but I think that MUFON does have very good coverage for gathering a lot of different cases from all of the different states in the United States. I'm not really aware of what their capability is internationally, but I believe back in 2009, MUFON were a very, very efficient organization.
Now, I know there are groups in the United States, many of them associated with Dr. Stephen Greer, that claim to be able to initiate contact of some sort or communication or to conjure up or call down UFOs. And so they go out at night and they seem to be able to precipitate sightings of some sort. It would seem as if there might be the potential for two-way interaction. Have you looked into that at all?
No, we have not. And that is something we've heard about Dr. Greer's activities, but we have not actually had the opportunity to look into it. I know that there are other people, and even again, I think of Brazil, where there has been claims of people being able to quote unquote summon UFO activity through a form of meditation, analogous to what Dr. Greer and his team have claimed. We have not really looked into that whole aspect.
I, of course, documented something similar in my book, The PK Man. So I'm inclined to think that the potential for some sort of reciprocal interaction between the humans and whatever this phenomenon is, it's not a dead possibility that something might yet emerge.
I would tend to agree with you just from what we were discussing earlier about that the focus on human consciousness and the use of human consciousness during meditation. I was very intrigued with one of Bernardo Kastrup's Scientific American articles in which he talked about the so-called dashboard effect, or the dashboard model of human perception, which is basically, that it's the equivalent of flying in an airplane and reading all of the instruments in the airplane by means of the dashboard. But outside the airplane is something completely different, and the Kastrup model would be, human five senses is essentially an aircraft dashboard, and we really have no idea what's outside that dashboard. So in line of what you're suggesting, maybe the act of meditation or the act of remote viewing or, shamanic activities is a way of going outside this dashboard and accessing what's outside the dashboard. It's sort of right now it's in the realm of speculation, but I do see it as a possibility. Various DMT associated exercises, even though, I would be cautious about DMT in the absence of very well studied cultural support, because I think DMT tourism and ayahuasca tourism may even have negative effects in the long run when people really don't know what they're doing. But I guess the point is that there may be modalities that we already know about in terms of enhancing our human consciousness ability to interact with these UFOs. And, we have never looked into what Dr. Greer and his team are doing.
Well, it does seem that you're suggesting that one important avenue, maybe not the only avenue, but certainly a very significant and not fully explored avenue for UFO researchers is to look more deeply into the nature of consciousness itself and particularly the far reaches of consciousness and the powers of consciousness, and how that would intersect with all of these uncanny UFO-related reports.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think I would categorize this in the, as high risk research. If in an ideal world where there would be sort of a really robust UFO program going, I would recapitulate the full scope of AAWSAP and do both sensor-driven, measurements on UFO performance. I would also look at human effects, psychological and pathological, medical injury, so all the way out through paranormal effects. But I would also have a separate line on the water associated with some high-risk investigations into how exactly human consciousness could possibly reach beyond the metaphor of the dashboard. So I believe, that there's also some unusually interesting correlations between the afterlife and UFOs. Also, I mentioned a few of these occasions when there seemed to be crossover between UFOs and the afterlife. I'm compiling a list of these overlaps, and there are many different overlaps. Again, I would categorize this in the realm of high risk. I think there's room for a mainstream, well-funded, robust UFO program, but I also think there's room for a smaller, more focused program on how UFO may interact with human consciousness, or how human consciousness may interact with UFOs. Just thinking back to the book that we talked about just previously, Ingo Swann's book Penetration. One of the tasks he was assigned to do by Axelrod was actually to remote view the moon, and during his journey of consciousness to the moon, he did interact with beings on the moon, allegedly, but those beings were extremely unfriendly, and they essentially told him to get out of there. Another Michael Jordan remote viewer by the name of Joe McMoneagle is also on the record with attempting to remote view UFOs. And Joe McMoneagle also got a very unfriendly reaction from the denizens of the UFO realm when his consciousness started probing. So maybe there's a sort of a note of caution there with respect to how human consciousness could interact with UFOs. For example, I have not heard of any instances of the so-called Hitchhiker Effect as a result of meditation, summoning UFOs, and all of that. I've no idea if there's any data on that. It's something that should be possibly looked into.
Colm, we've covered a lot of ground, and I know in spite of that, we're still just scratching the surface. I hope to have several more conversations with you about this topic. I know that our viewers are fascinated. I know that we've had a very strong response to our previous conversation in this area, and I'm sure many of our viewers are interested to see what you yourself, with your enormous background in the field, are going to be doing next.
Yes, well, I definitely would be happy to continue this conversation, and it's a real pleasure to talk with you as always.
Thank you, Colm, for being with me today.
Thank you very much.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.